The stranger who saved his life, a businessman's 25-year search for the woman he shared one night with before she disappeared, and an emotional reunion after 25 years. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Heavenly Father, I know you see the sorrow and grief in the heart of the one reading this. Comfort them, Lord, in this time of pain and sadness. Wrap your loving arms around them and bring them solace. Remind them of your promise to be near the broken-hearted and give them the strength to endure this difficult season. Today, I'm feeling deeply upset and disheartened. I've been thinking about quitting writing because I've noticed that many fake channels are using my name and voice to create low-quality content. What hurts even more is seeing some of you commenting on those channels, either thanking Mr. Peter or criticizing me for content I didn't create. I want to remind you all once again, I have only one official channel, Mr. Peter Stories. I've mentioned this countless times and urged you to subscribe to avoid being misled by frauds. But it seems some of you are not taking this seriously. What's even more painful is that these fake channels are now using AI to clone my voice. Some people are abusing me, thinking I'm the one behind that poor quality content. This has brought me to tears today. I've worked so hard to create genuine, heartfelt stories for you, but it feels like many of you have found alternatives and forgotten the original. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I'm deeply saddened and may stop writing altogether. Thank you to those who have always supported me. I love you all, and I hope you'll help protect my work and legacy. Let's begin the story. The rhythmic pounding of rain against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital seemed to echo the erratic beating of James's heart as he lay in the emergency room, fighting for his life. The October storm raged outside, but inside, an even fiercer battle was being waged. At 40 years old, successful and wealthy, he had never imagined he would face mortality so soon, so suddenly. The fluorescent lights above him blurred and sharpened in waves as medical staff rushed around him, their voices a cacophony of urgent commands and medical terminology. The pain in his chest was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a vice grip of agony that made every breath a conscious effort. Through the fog of his distress, he could hear the monitor's irregular beeping, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "BP's dropping. We need to act now," someone called out, their voice sharp with urgency. The emergency room doors burst open, and through his wavering consciousness, James saw her for the first time. The young resident doctor moved with purposeful grace, her dark hands swift and sure as she took control of the situation. Even in his state of semi-consciousness, he noticed how the entire room seemed to respond to her presence, as if she carried an aura of calm competence that affected everyone around her. "Sir, stay with me." Her voice cut through the chaos, warm and commanding. Her eyes, when they met his, held both professional determination and genuine compassion. "I'm not letting you go anywhere tonight." The strength in her words seemed to anchor him, giving him something to hold on to as waves of pain threatened to pull him under. The next few hours became a blur of procedures and medications, but her voice remained constant, a lifeline in the storm. She worked tirelessly, refusing to leave his side even as other staff rotated through their shifts. Through moments of clarity, he caught glimpses of her, the way she pushed her braids back from her face with her forearm, maintaining sterility, how she hummed old jazz tunes under her breath when checking his vitals, the gentle way she adjusted his pillows when she thought he was sleeping. As dawn approached and his condition stabilized, James drifted in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, he found her checking his IV, her movements precise, despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind a gentle patter of rain that created an intimate atmosphere in the dimly lit room. "You saved my life," he managed to whisper, his voice rough from the tubes that had been down his throat earlier. She smiled, and for the first time he saw beyond the professional mask to the woman beneath. "That's what I'm here for," she replied, but there was something in her expression that suggested this was more than just another patient for her. In those quiet, pre-dawn hours, as the hospital hummed with muted activity beyond his door, they began to talk. Her voice took on a different quality as she spoke of her childhood in New Orleans, of summers spent listening to jazz float through the humid evening air while her grandmother cooked gumbo in a kitchen that always smelled of herbs and spices. She told him about her journey to become a doctor, the scholarships she'd fought for, the doubters she'd proved wrong, the nights spent studying while her peers were out living what they called their best years. "But this is my best life," she said, gesturing to the hospital room. "Moments like these, when I can make a difference, this is what I was meant for." James found himself sharing his own story in return, how he'd built his company from nothing but determination and a borrowed laptop, the lonely nights working in a tiny apartment, eating ramen noodles and dreaming of success. He told her about finally making it, only to find that his penthouse apartment felt emptier than that studio ever had. "Success is a strange thing," he mused, watching her check his heart monitor. "You spend your whole life chasing it, and when you catch it, you realize it's not quite what you thought it would be." She paused in her work, really looking at him. Maybe because success isn't about what you have, but about what you do with it. Their conversation meandered through philosophy, dreams, and regrets. She spoke about her plans to open clinics in underserved communities, her eyes lighting up as she described the changes she wanted to make in healthcare accessibility. He found himself offering suggestions about business models and funding sources, his mind already spinning with ways he could help make her vision a reality. As the night shifted toward morning, exhaustion finally began to catch up with her. She had worked 3 consecutive shifts, refusing to leave until she was certain he was stable. Her dedication moved something deep within him. When was the last time anyone had cared that much about his well-being? The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky in gentle pinks and golds when it happened. She was checking his vitals one last time before her relief arrived, and something in the moment felt charged with possibility. Perhaps it was the intimacy of having shared their stories, or the vulnerability of having faced death and emerged stronger. But when their eyes met, the professional distance between them dissolved. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened into something that spoke of shared understanding and unexpected connection. Her lips were soft against his, and he could feel her heart racing as fast as his own. When they parted, no words seemed necessary. She smiled, a mixture of joy and something like sadness in her expression, before settling into the chair beside his bed. "I should go soon," she murmured, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. "My relief will be here." But before she could finish the sentence, sleep claimed her. James watched her drift off, her features softening in repose, her hand still resting near his on the bed. He wanted to memorize everything about this moment. The way the early morning light played across her face, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the hint of a smile that lingered on her lips. The next time he opened his eyes, she was gone. The chair beside his bed was empty, and the morning shift was in full swing. A different doctor was reviewing his chart, explaining his recovery plan, but James could barely focus on the words. His eyes kept drifting to the empty chair, his mind replaying every moment of the night before. He didn't know her full name. In all their hours of conversation, somehow that detail had never seemed important. Now, as he lay there listening to the routine sounds of the hospital morning, that oversight felt like a physical ache in his chest, distinct from his healing heart. The day nurse noticed his distraction and misinterpreted it as pain, adjusting his medication, but no medicine could treat this new ache that was forming, the sense that something precious had slipped away before he'd fully grasped its worth. As he drifted off under the influence of pain medication, his last conscious thought was of her smile, and a promise to himself that somehow, someday, he would find her again. What he didn't know then, as sleep claimed him, was that this moment would set in motion a search that would span 25 years. He couldn't have known that the young resident doctor who had saved his life would become both his most cherished memory and his greatest quest. That every success, every achievement, every milestone in the years to come would feel incomplete without her there to share it. The rain had stopped outside his window, leaving behind a world washed clean and new. Inside room 412 of St. Mary's Hospital, James slept, his healing heart already beginning its longest journey, not toward recovery, but toward a love that would take 25 years to find its way home. The morning shift changed to afternoon, and afternoon to evening, but he remained lost in dreams of gentle hands and jazz music, of shared confidences, and a kiss that tasted of promise. Outside his room, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm of life, death, and healing, unaware that within its walls a love story had begun that would take a quarter of a century to reach its next chapter. Chapter 2. Dawn's Fleeting Promise. The hours between midnight and dawn held a peculiar magic in the hospital, a liminal space where truth flowed more freely than daylight would allow. As James lay awake in his hospital bed, each breath a reminder of his brush with mortality, he found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced aloud before. The young doctor sat in the chair beside him, her white coat draped over its back, looking more like a confidant than a medical professional in these intimate hours. "Tell me more about New Orleans," he asked, his voice stronger now than it had been earlier. The pain medication had created a comfortable haze, but his mind remained sharp, hungry for every detail she would share. She smiled, and in the dim light of the medical monitors, her eyes took on a distant, nostalgic gleam. "Picture a city where music isn't just heard, it's felt," she began, her voice taking on the rich cadence of her hometown. "Every street corner has its own rhythm, every neighborhood its own song. My grandmother's house was just off Frenchman Street, this beautiful old Victorian with a wraparound porch where we'd sit in the evenings, listening to jazz drift up from the clubs below." She described scenes from her childhood with such vivid detail that James could almost smell the magnolias and jasmine, could almost taste the rich, dark roux of her grandmother's gumbo. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke about Sunday afternoons, when the whole neighborhood would gather for impromptu concerts and potluck dinners that lasted well into the night. "But it wasn't all romance and music," she continued, her expression growing more serious. "I watched my grandmother, a midwife, care for women who couldn't afford proper medical care. She'd work for whatever they could offer, sometimes just a bowl of jambalaya or a promise to help another neighbor in need. That's when I knew I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to bridge that gap between the medicine I saw in textbooks and the reality of healthcare in communities like mine." James found himself sharing his own story in return. Speaking of things he'd never told anyone else, he described the death of his parents when he was young, how their loss had driven him to succeed at any cost. "I thought if I could just make enough money, be important enough, I'd never feel that vulnerable again," he admitted, watching the shadows play across the ceiling. "Funny how it took a heart attack to show me how wrong I was." She reached out then, her hand warm against his. "Sometimes we have to break before we can heal properly," she said softly. The touch of her hand sent a current through him that had nothing to do with his medical condition. As the night deepened, Their conversation flowed from childhood memories to future dreams. She spoke passionately about her plans to revolutionize community healthcare, describing the clinics she wanted to establish in underserved areas. Her eyes lit up as she detailed her vision of integrating traditional medical practices with modern healthcare, creating spaces where people would feel both cared for and respected. "The problem with modern medicine," she explained, leaning forward in her chair, "is that we've lost the human connection. We treat symptoms, not people. I want to change that." James found himself mentally taking notes, his business mind already whirring with possibilities. "You'd need strategic planning," he mused. "Location analysis, community partnerships, sustainable funding models." He paused, seeing her surprised expression. "Sorry, old habits die hard. When I see a good idea, I can't help but think about how to make it reality." She laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the sterile hospital room. "Most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about healthcare infrastructure. You're the first person who's wanted to make a business plan." "I'm not most people," he replied, and something in his tone made her breath catch. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and for a moment the hospital around them seemed to fade away. The conversation shifted then, becoming more personal. She told him about the challenges she'd faced as a black woman in medicine, the subtle and not so subtle discrimination, the constant pressure to prove herself. "But every obstacle just made me more determined," she said firmly. Each no became a reason to push harder. James shared his own struggles, the years of working 18-hour days, the relationships he'd sacrificed for success, the hollow feeling of achieving everything he'd thought he wanted only to find himself alone at the top. "My penthouse has a view of the entire city," he said quietly. "But some nights I miss the view of the brick wall outside my first apartment. At least then I had something to strive for." "Maybe that's what you needed," she suggested, adjusting his IV with practiced ease, even as she maintained their conversation. "Not another goal, but a purpose." Her words struck him deeply, touching something he hadn't even realized was missing. He watched her move around his room, noting how she managed to maintain her grace even after nearly 24 hours on duty. There was something mesmerizing about the way she combined professional efficiency with genuine warmth. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky outside his window, their conversation took on an almost dreamlike quality. She spoke of her grandmother's belief in fate, in the way lives could intersect at exactly the right moment. "She always said that timing was God's way of keeping the world in balance," she murmured, her voice growing heavy with exhaustion. James wanted to ask her name then, wanted to tell her that this couldn't be the end of their story, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the magic of the moment, the feeling that naming it might somehow break its spell. Or perhaps it was the way she was looking at him, as if she too felt the significance of what was passing between them. The kiss, when it happened, felt both inevitable and surprising. She had leaned over to check his heart monitor one last time, and suddenly the professional distance between them dissolved. Her lips were soft against his, carrying a hint of the coffee she'd been drinking to stay awake. The kiss deepened, speaking of possibilities and promises, of connections that transcended their brief acquaintance. When they parted, words seemed inadequate. She smiled at him, a smile that held joy and sadness in equal measure, before settling into the chair beside his bed. "I should go soon," she whispered, but her eyes were already closing, the exhaustion of her long shift finally claiming her. James watched her sleep, the early morning light casting a gentle glow across her features. He wanted to memorize everything about this moment. The way her braids fell across her shoulder, the slight furrow between her brows that relaxed as she slept, the rhythm of her breathing. Something told him this moment was precious, fleeting, though he couldn't have known just how fleeting it would prove to be. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway grew louder, signaling the arrival of the morning shift. James closed his eyes, not wanting to share this intimate moment with anyone else. When he opened them again, she was gone. The chair beside his bed was empty, the morning sun streaming through the window as if to mock the magic of the night before. His heart monitor picked up its pace as panic set in. He pressed the call button, needing to know where she had gone, when she would return. The morning nurse who answered seemed confused by his urgency. The resident from last night? Her rotation ended this morning. She had to leave. There was some kind of family emergency. The words hit him like a physical blow. Family emergency. She was gone, and he didn't even know her full name. In all their hours of conversation, somehow that detail had never seemed important. Now it felt like a crucial oversight, the first of many obstacles in what would become a 25-year journey to find her again. The morning shift bustled around him, checking vitals, adjusting medications, explaining discharge procedures. But James barely heard them. His mind was focused on replaying every moment of the night before, committing each detail to memory. The way she spoke about New Orleans, her dreams for the future, the warmth of her hand against his, the taste of their kiss, these memories would have to sustain him through the long search ahead. That evening, as he watched the sunset paint the sky in shades that reminded him of her smile, James made a silent vow. He would find her again, no matter how long it took. He didn't know then that this promise would shape the next 25 years of his life, that every decision, every success, every moment would be touched by the absence of the woman who had saved not just his life, but his soul. Outside his window, the city was coming alive with evening lights, each one a potential beacon leading to her. Somewhere out there, she was starting a new chapter of her own story. It would take 25 years for their paths to cross again, but in that hospital room, as night fell once more, James's journey was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Search Begins recovery became a dual journey for James, healing his body while searching for the woman who had saved it. As soon as he was strong enough to sit up in bed, he began his quest, starting with the most obvious avenue, the hospital administration. The fluorescent lights of the administrative office seemed harsh after the intimate darkness of that night, making everything feel more clinical, more impossible. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison," the hospital administrator said, shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency. "Our resident rotations are confidential information. Besides, with the emergency relocation, her paperwork was never properly filed." The woman's voice held a note of genuine sympathy, but her words offered no hope. "All I can tell you is that she was here as part of a visiting resident program." James leaned heavily on his cane, his body still weak from surgery, but his mind sharp with purpose. There must be something, payroll records, staff photos, anything. His voice carried the authority that had built his empire, but here in the hospital corridors, that power meant nothing. The administrator hesitated, then spoke softly. There was some confusion that morning. A family emergency called her away suddenly. Something about her grandmother in New Orleans having a stroke. In the chaos, much of the standard documentation wasn't completed. It was highly irregular, but these things happen in teaching hospitals. New Orleans. The word echoed in his mind, bringing back memories of her stories about jazz-filled evenings and her grandmother's cooking. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he made his way back to his room, leaning against the walls for support, his mind was already formulating plans, creating lists, developing strategies. This was, after all, what he did best, solving problems, finding solutions, making the impossible possible. In the weeks that followed, as his body slowly healed, James threw himself into the search with the same dedication that had built his business empire. He hired the best private investigators, each one promising results, each one ultimately returning with nothing but fragments and maybes. The medical community in New Orleans is tight-knit, one investigator reported, standing in James's office with hat in hand. There's word of a brilliant young black female resident who graduated early from medical school, but the trail goes cold after that. It's like she vanished into the healthcare system. James stared out his office window, the city sprawling below, like a maze of possibilities. Each dead end only strengthened his resolve. He began writing letters, hundreds of them, to medical schools across the country, describing her, hoping someone would recognize the promising young doctor who hummed jazz while she worked. Most schools didn't respond. Those that did cited privacy regulations or simply had no information to share. But occasionally a small detail would emerge, a research paper on cardiac care that matched her passionate ideas about community health, a presentation at a medical conference that echoed her vision for integrated healthcare, a brief mention in a medical journal that captured her unique approach to patient care. "You're chasing a ghost," his friend Michael told him over dinner one evening, 6 months into the search. "Do you realize how many female doctors there are in this country? How many hospitals? How many possibilities?" James twirled his untouched wineglass, watching the liquid catch the light. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't just about finding someone, it's about finding the person who showed me what I'd been missing my entire life. Success, wealth, power. I had all of that. But in those few hours, she showed me what it means to have purpose." He began establishing free clinics in underserved communities across the country, each one a beacon he hoped might draw her attention. The clinics embodied everything she had talked about that night: integrated care, community involvement, dignity in treatment. Each opening was both a tribute to her vision and a hope that she might recognize her dreams taking shape and reach out. The years began to blur together, marked by moments of hope and disappointment. A promising lead in Chicago turned out to be another doctor with a similar background. A clinic in Atlanta reported a doctor matching her description, but by the time James arrived, she had moved on. Each near miss felt like losing her all over again. He dated occasionally, more out of social obligation than genuine interest. But every relationship ended the same way, with the gentle acknowledgement that his heart was still searching. "You're in love with a memory," his last girlfriend had said kindly as she left. "How can anyone compete with that?" His company continued to grow, but every success felt incomplete. He found himself speaking at charity events, medical fundraisers, hospital board meetings, anywhere that might put him in contact with someone who knew her. His reputation as a philanthropist in the medical community grew, but the one person he hoped would notice remained elusive. 10 years into the search, he received a promising lead from a hospital in Memphis. "There was a doctor here," the administrator said over the phone, her voice excited. "She matches your description perfectly. She worked in our cardiac unit for 3 years before moving on. Let me find her forwarding address." James held his breath, his hand gripping the phone tightly. The rustling of papers on the other end of the line seemed to last an eternity. "I'm sorry," the administrator finally said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "The address we have is no longer valid. She left no forwarding information." Another dead end, but something about this one felt different. The timing was right, the description matched, and the focus on cardiac care aligned with her interests. He spent months following this lead, tracing her movements through the hospital system, always seeming to be just one step behind. 15 years into the search, technology began to change the game. The internet emerged, bringing with it new possibilities and new ways to search. James hired tech experts to scour medical databases, professional networks, and social media platforms. But the digital age brought its own challenges: too much information, too many possibilities, too many dead ends. It's like trying to find a specific drop of water in the ocean, his head of IT explained, showing him the thousands of search results. Without more specific information, a name, a date of birth, something concrete, we're just guessing. But James refused to give up. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting medical education for minority women, hoping to create a network that might lead him to her. The foundation's work was meaningful and important, changing lives and opening doors for a new generation of doctors. Yet each graduation ceremony, each award presentation, each scholarship granted reminded him of the one doctor he couldn't find. 20 years into the search, his company's board suggested he consider retirement. He was still sharp, still effective, but they worried about his single-minded dedication to what they saw as an impossible quest. Instead of retiring, he doubled down, using his position to expand his search globally. He attended medical conferences around the world, always scanning the crowds for her face, always listening for the sound of jazz hummed under breath. The search had become part of who he was, as natural as breathing. His staff knew to forward any information about female doctors matching her description. Hospital administrators across the country recognized his name, not just as a businessman and philanthropist, but as the man searching for a doctor who had vanished like morning mist. 25 years seemed like an impossible span of time, yet here he was, his hair now silver, his face lined with years of searching, still following every lead, still hoping. The young man who had suffered a heart attack had become a distinguished gentleman who had transformed healthcare access across the country, all while searching for the woman who had inspired it all. His office walls were covered with maps, marking every place he'd looked, every hospital he'd contacted, every lead he'd followed. To others, it might have seemed obsessive, but to James it was a visual representation of his heart's journey. Somewhere in this vast web of possibilities, she was living her life, perhaps wondering about him too. The morning sun streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across the maps and documents that chronicled his search. Another day was beginning, another chance to find her. His assistant would soon arrive with the daily reports, perhaps containing another lead, another possibility, another hope. In the quiet of the early morning, James touched the scar on his chest, the physical reminder of the night that had changed everything. Somewhere out there, she was preparing for another day of healing, of making a difference in her community. He didn't know that he was finally getting closer, that the longest journey of his life was nearing its end. He only knew that he would never stop searching, never stop hoping, never stop believing that someday, somehow, he would find her again. Chapter 4. Years of echoes. Time has a way of both healing and deepening wounds, and for James, each passing year brought both solace and sorrow. His office had become a testament to his search, walls covered with maps tracking possible sightings, filing cabinets stuffed with reports from private investigators, and a constantly updated database of medical conferences and healthcare initiatives across the country. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, casting long shadows across the scattered papers on his desk. Another medical conference program lay open before him, his eyes scanning the list of speakers and attendees for the 1000th time. Every black female doctor's name triggered a spark of hope, each potential match sending his heart racing just as it had that night in the hospital. "Mr. Harrison," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Reynolds is here for your cardiac checkup." James smiled at the irony. These quarterly checkups had become more than just medical necessities. They were reminders of the night that had changed everything. Dr. Reynolds, a kind-faced man in his 60s, had been monitoring James's heart health for the past decade. "Your heart's stronger than ever," Dr. Reynolds said, reviewing the latest test results. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." He paused, studying James's face. "Though I wish you'd get more rest. This search, it's becoming your whole life." James stood by the window, watching the city wake up below. "This search is what keeps my heart strong," he replied quietly. "Every lead, every possibility, they're like echoes of that night. As long as I can hear them, I know I'm on the right path." The doctor sighed, packing away his stethoscope. "Just remember, stress is still the enemy. Even a heart healed by love can be damaged by obsession." But was it obsession? James pondered this question as he reviewed the latest reports from his network of contacts. He'd established charitable foundations, funded medical research, built clinics in underserved communities, all in hopes of creating a web wide enough to catch any trace of her. These weren't just acts of searching. They were fulfillments of the dreams she'd shared during those precious hours. The memories of that night remained crystal clear, refusing to fade with time. He could still hear the soft jazz melody she hummed while checking his vitals, still feel the gentle confidence in her hands as she adjusted his IV. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he found himself back in that hospital room, listening to her stories of New Orleans and sharing dreams that seemed possible only in that liminal space between night and day. His daily routine had become a careful balance of running his company and pursuing the search. Each morning began with reviews of hospital staff changes across the country, particularly in areas with strong jazz communities or innovative community health programs. His team had developed algorithms to track medical publications, looking for research that matched her passionate ideas about integrated healthcare. "There's a promising lead in Detroit," his head investigator reported one afternoon. A doctor matching her description established a community health center there 3 years ago. The program integrates traditional medicine with modern healthcare, just like she talked about. James's heart leaped, but experience had taught him to temper his hope. "Show me everything." The investigation revealed another dead end. The doctor in question was a decade too young to be her, but the program itself was exactly what she had envisioned that night. James immediately directed his foundation to provide funding, ensuring that at least this echo of her dreams would continue to help others. Social events had become exercises in networking, each charity gala or medical fundraiser an opportunity to expand his search. He'd become known in these circles not just as a successful businessman, but as a passionate advocate for healthcare reform. Some whispered about the romantic tragedy of his quest, while others admired the way his search had transformed into a mission to improve healthcare access across the country. "You've done more for community healthcare than most career medical professionals," a hospital administrator told him at a fundraising dinner. "Whatever or whoever inspired this passion, we're grateful." James nodded politely, but his eyes continued scanning the crowd as they always did. Every glimpse of dark braids, every sound of feminine laughter that carried hints of New Orleans warmth sent a jolt through his system. After all these years, his body still responded to these echoes of her presence. Dating had become a series of polite disappointments. The women he met were accomplished, beautiful, intelligent, but each relationship ended when they realized they were competing with a memory that had shaped his entire life. "It's not just that you're looking for her," his last girlfriend had said during their gentle breakup. "It's that you've built your whole world around the person she inspired you to be. How can anyone compete with that kind of impact?" She was right, of course. The night that had saved his life had also given it new purpose. Every clinic he opened, every scholarship he funded, every medical program he supported was both a tribute to her vision and a hope that she might recognize her dreams taking shape and reach out. His friends had long since stopped suggesting he move on. They'd watched as his search transformed from a personal quest into a mission that had improved countless lives. The young businessman, focused solely on profit, had become a distinguished philanthropist. His silver hair and tailored suits now, accompanied by a reputation for genuine compassion and dedication to healthcare reform. Sitting in his office late one evening, James reviewed the latest updates to his search database. Technology had evolved dramatically over the years, offering new ways to track and connect information. Social media, professional networks, digital medical records, each advancement brought new possibilities and new challenges. We've expanded the algorithm to include facial recognition, his tech team reported. If she appears in any medical conference photos or hospital staff directories, we'll know. But technology couldn't capture the essence of what he was searching for. The warmth in her voice when she spoke of her grandmother's wisdom, the passion in her eyes when she described her vision for community health care, the way her presence had filled that hospital room with possibility. The years had left their mark on him, silver threading through his hair, lines etching themselves around his eyes, his face gaining the distinguished look of a man who had lived with purpose. But his memory of her remained unchanged, preserved in the amber of that singular night. Sometimes in his dreams he was back in that hospital room, watching the dawn light paint her sleeping face in gentle gold. In these dreams he always asked her name, always found a way to keep her from disappearing. But reality had written a different story, one that had stretched across 25 years of searching. His office had become a chronicle of this search, each item a marker on this long journey. The first private investigator's report, now yellowed with age. The map where he'd first traced possible locations of her medical residency. Photographs of clinic openings, each one a beacon he hoped might draw her attention. News clippings about his healthcare initiatives, which had grown from personal quest to public mission. Late at night, when the city lights twinkled below like earthbound stars, he would sometimes stand at his window and imagine her somewhere out there, perhaps looking up at the same sky. Was she still humming jazz tunes while she worked? Had she achieved her dreams of revolutionizing community healthcare? Did she ever think about that night, about the businessman whose life she'd saved in more ways than one? The search had become more than just finding a person. It had become a journey of transformation, both personal and public. The clinics he'd established were making real differences in communities across the country. The scholarships he'd created were helping a new generation of doctors pursue their dreams. Even if he never found her, her influence had created ripples of positive change that would continue long after he was gone. But still, he searched. Each morning brought new possibilities. Each report offered new leads. Each medical conference held the potential for recognition. 25 years had passed, but his determination remained undiminished. Somewhere out there, she was living her life, perhaps wondering about him too. And until he found her, he would continue following these echoes, these traces of her presence that had shaped his world in such profound ways. The night deepened outside his office window, the city settling into its evening rhythm. Tomorrow would bring new reports, new possibilities, new echoes to follow. But tonight, in the quiet of his office, James allowed himself to remember that night in perfect detail. The soft beeping of monitors, the gentle rain against windows, the way her voice had carried dreams of making healthcare more human, more compassionate. He couldn't know that the longest search of his life was nearing its end, that fate was finally aligning the stars that had scattered 25 years ago. He only knew that somewhere out there she was still healing, still making a difference, still carrying the same passion that had saved his life and given it new purpose. And as long as that was true, he would never stop searching. Chapter 5. The world changes. The world transformed dramatically over the 25 years of James's search, technology advancing at a pace that would have seemed impossible that night in the hospital. He watched as paper records gave way to digital databases, as letters became emails, as the internet grew from a curiosity to a necessity. Each advancement brought new hope and new challenges in his quest to find her. In his modernized office, screens had replaced many of the maps and papers that once covered his walls. Digital displays showed real-time updates from hospitals across the country, tracking staff changes, medical publications, and community health initiatives. The old filing cabinets remained, though, filled with 2 decades of physical records, a testament to the years before everything became digital. The healthcare landscape is completely different now, his chief of research reported during their weekly meeting. Electronic health records, telemedicine, AI diagnostics, it's revolutionizing how we track medical professionals. She paused, studying the latest data scrolling across her tablet. But it also means she could be practicing anywhere in the world, connecting with patients virtually. James ran a hand through his silver hair, remembering how she had talked about making healthcare more accessible. Would she have embraced these changes? He could almost hear her voice, passionate about the possibilities. Imagine reaching patients in remote areas, bringing specialized care to communities that never had access before. Social media had emerged as both blessing and curse in his search. Every professional networking site, every medical forum, every online medical conference became a potential point of connection. His team monitored these platforms constantly, looking for any trace of a black female doctor whose career path matched what they knew of her. "We've created algorithms to track specific markers," his tech team explained. Jazz connections, New Orleans background, community health focus, cardiac specialization. Any doctor who matches multiple criteria gets flagged for investigation. The world had become smaller in many ways, more connected, yet finding her remained elusive. Each new technology brought fresh hope, only to reveal new complexities. Facial recognition software scanned medical conference photos, but many doctors opted out of online directories. Professional networks mapped career paths, but some practitioners chose privacy over visibility. His own appearance had changed with the years, hair turned fully silver, face lined with experience, eyes carrying both wisdom and persistent hope. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, he wondered if she would recognize him now. Would she see the same man whose life she'd saved that night, or would the years between them create yet another barrier? Dating had become increasingly complicated in this new era. Well-meaning friends tried to interest him in online dating, suggesting he might find someone new. "The world's changed," they would say. "There are so many ways to connect now." But they didn't understand that he wasn't looking for connection. He was searching for reconnection, for the completion of a story that had begun 25 years ago. His healthcare initiatives had evolved with the times. The free clinics he'd established now included telemedicine services, reaching patients in areas she had dreamed of serving. Each technological advancement was implemented with her vision in mind, making healthcare more accessible, more human, more integrated with community needs. "Your foundation's digital health programs are revolutionary," a healthcare administrator told him at a virtual conference. "The way you've combined traditional community outreach with modern technology, it's exactly what the industry needs." If only she could see how her dreams had taken shape, how her passionate ideas from that night had evolved into real-world solutions. The clinics now used AI to help diagnose conditions, but always with the human touch she had emphasized. Electronic health records made patient care more efficient, but staff were trained to maintain the personal connection she had valued so highly. His search methods adapted to each new technological wave. Databases grew more sophisticated, cross-referencing capabilities expanded, and social networks provided new ways to track career paths. Yet with each advancement, he felt both closer to and further from finding her. The digital footprint of medical professionals is larger than ever, his head of IT explained during a strategy session, but so is their ability to maintain privacy. Many doctors, especially those focused on community care, choose to minimize their online presence. The years had taught him patience, but they had not diminished his determination. Each morning still brought the possibility of finding her. Each new technological tool offered another way to search. His silver hair and distinguished appearance now commanded respect in medical circles. His foundation's work opening doors that had once been closed. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would pull out the oldest files, the initial hospital records, the first private investigator reports, the yellowed maps marking possible locations. These paper trails seemed almost quaint now, in an age of digital everything, but they held a tangibility that virtual searches lacked. His office had become a timeline of technological progress, old filing cabinets beside state-of-the-art computers, paper maps next to digital displays, handwritten notes alongside tablet screens. Each item represented a different phase of his search, a different hope of finding her. The world outside his window had changed too. The city skyline had grown taller, sleeker, more modern. Cars had become quieter, buildings smarter, communication instant. But somewhere in this changed world, she was still helping people, still making a difference, still carrying the same passion that had saved his life that night. 25 years had brought changes he could never have imagined, but his heart remained constant in its quest. Each new technology, each advancement, each evolution in healthcare brought both challenge and hope. The world had transformed around him, but his purpose remained unchanged, finding the woman who had given his life new meaning on a rainy night a quarter century ago. He couldn't know that all these changes, all this technology, would finally help lead him to her. That somewhere in the vast digital landscape, a thread would emerge that would guide him to their reunion. For now he continued to adapt, to search, to hope, knowing that in this ever-changing world, the truth of their connection remained constant. Chapter 6. An unexpected thread discovery often comes in unexpected moments, arriving not with fanfare but with the quiet certainty of dawn. For James, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, as his assistant placed the latest medical journal on his desk alongside his morning coffee. He almost missed it. After 25 years of searching, eyes scanning countless publications, the words had begun to blur together, but something about the article caught his attention. Revolutionary approach to rural cardiac care, a 20-year study of community-based prevention programs. The methodology described seemed familiar, a perfect blend of traditional community engagement and modern medical practices. His heart began to race as he read further, recognizing ideas that had been shared in whispers during that long-ago night. The author's writing style carried echoes of their conversation, the same passion for integrating community wisdom with modern medicine, the same emphasis on treating patients as whole people rather than collections of symptoms. His hands trembled as he read the author's credentials, a distinguished physician who had spent decades building a network of community health centers across rural Louisiana. "Get me everything you can find about this doctor," he instructed his team, trying to keep his voice steady despite the hope surging through him. "Every paper, every presentation, every community program she's established, and check if there's any connection to New Orleans, particularly from 25 years ago." His office quickly transformed into a command center of focused activity. Screens displayed medical publications, conference proceedings, and community health center records. Each new piece of information strengthened the connection. The timing matched, the career trajectory aligned with everything he knew about her. "Look at this," his research director said, pulling up an archived conference presentation. She established her first clinic in a converted jazz club in New Orleans, integrating local healing traditions with modern cardiac care. The timing matches. It would have been right after she left the hospital. James studied the grainy conference photo, his heart recognizing what his eyes couldn't quite make out. The image was poor quality, taken from the back of the room, but there was something in the speaker's posture, in the way she gestured while making a point, that sent a jolt of recognition through him. The search narrowed to Louisiana's rural communities, where she had built a network of health centers that embodied everything she had dreamed of that night. Each clinic combined state-of-the-art cardiac care with community outreach programs, exactly as she had envisioned while sitting beside his hospital bed. "The latest center is in a small town outside New Orleans," his assistant reported, marking the location on a digital map. "It opened 6 months ago." The local paper ran a story about their innovative approach to combining traditional healing practices with modern medicine. James stood at his window, watching the city bustle below as his team continued their research. 25 years of searching, and now every new detail seemed to confirm what his heart already knew. The writing style in her medical papers carried the same warmth and passion he remembered from their conversation. The healthcare philosophy she'd developed matched perfectly with the dreams she'd shared that night. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath his suit. How many times had that heart nearly given up hope? How many false leads and disappointments had it endured? Yet now it raced with possibility, recognizing the truth before his mind could fully process it. "There's more," his head of research said, her voice tight with excitement. "The clinic's website has a section about their founding philosophy. Listen to this. Healthcare isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about treating people. Every patient carries their own story, their own wisdom, their own path to healing. Our role is to walk alongside them, combining the best of modern medicine with the healing traditions that have sustained communities for generations." The words could have been lifted directly from their conversation that night, when she had shared her vision of what healthcare could be. James closed his eyes, remembering how passionate she had been, how her eyes had lit up as she described her dreams of revolutionizing community healthcare. His team worked through the night, gathering every piece of information they could find. The picture that emerged was of a doctor who had spent 25 years building something remarkable, a network of clinics that brought quality cardiac care to communities that had never had access before. "The local paper in Louisiana ran a profile last month," his assistant said, placing the printout on his desk. "They interviewed staff at the newest clinic. One of the nurses mentioned that the doctor still hums jazz while she works, saying it helps patients feel more at ease." That detail, so small yet so significant, made James's breath catch. How many times had he remembered her humming softly while checking his vitals, the gentle jazz melodies creating an atmosphere of calm in that sterile hospital room. The latest clinic was a modern facility housed in a renovated old building, its architecture blending seamlessly with the local community. The website showed photos of the exterior, wide porches reminiscent of traditional Louisiana homes, rocking chairs where patients could sit and talk, gardens filled with local medicinal plants. "She's there now," his assistant confirmed, checking the clinic's schedule. "They're having a community health fair this week, focusing on cardiac prevention and early intervention." James stood in his office, surrounded by 25 years of searching, condensed into files, screens, and memories. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades that reminded him of that dawn when she had disappeared from his life. Now, finally, he had found her, or rather found where her dreams had led her. His team waited expectantly, watching their normally composed boss struggle with emotions he couldn't quite contain. "Book the flight," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling, "and find out everything you can about this health fair." Plans were quickly made. His private jet would leave in the morning, landing at a small airport near the clinic. The health fair would provide the perfect opportunity to see her first, to confirm what his heart already knew, that the doctor who had saved his life and transformed his world had been building her own dream all these years. That night, in his penthouse apartment, James packed with trembling hands. "What do you wear to meet the woman you've been searching for 25 years?" His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his suit perfectly tailored, but would she recognize him? Would she see past the years to the man whose life she had saved that night? He slept little, his mind too full of questions and possibilities. What would he say when he saw her? How could he explain what these 25 years had meant? How her influence had shaped not just his life, but the lives of countless others through his healthcare initiatives? The night seemed endless, each minute stretching like the years he had spent searching. Tomorrow, he would board a plane to Louisiana. Tomorrow, he would finally see if the thread he had found would lead him to her. Tomorrow, 25 years of searching would either end in joy or heartbreak. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars, each one a reminder of the nights he had spent wondering where she was, what she was doing, if she ever thought about that night that had changed both their lives. Soon, he would have his answers. Soon, the longest search of his life would reach its conclusion. He couldn't know what awaited him in that small Louisiana town, couldn't predict how she would react to seeing him after all these years. But as he watched the night sky, his heart beat with a certainty he hadn't felt since that dawn 25 years ago. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had found her. The dream she had shared with him that night had become reality, touching lives and healing hearts in ways neither of them could have imagined. Chapter 7. The Journey South. The morning air held a crisp anticipation as James boarded his private jet, every mile ahead weighted with 25 years of searching. The sleek aircraft seemed too modern, too swift for a journey that had taken a quarter century. As they lifted into the dawn sky, he watched his city shrink below, remembering another dawn when she had slipped away like morning mist. His pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Weather in Louisiana looks clear, sir. We should land on schedule. The flight would take only a few hours," a stark contrast to the decades-long search that had led to this moment. James closed his eyes, his hand absently touching the scar on his chest, feeling his heart's steady rhythm beneath his crisp white shirt. Through the window, clouds drifted past like memories. He had imagined this journey countless times over the years, played out every possible scenario. Would she remember him? Would she understand why he had searched for so long? The questions that had haunted him for 25 years now demanded immediate answers. As they descended into Louisiana airspace, the landscape below transformed. Modern cities gave way to smaller towns, then to swathes of green broken by winding rivers and bayous. Spanish moss draped ancient oaks like silver veils, and the air took on the thick, sweet quality he remembered from her descriptions of home. 10 minutes to landing, Mr. Harrison," the pilot announced. James straightened his tie, studying his reflection in the window. Silver hair had replaced the dark brown of 25 years ago, and lines of experience marked his face, but his eyes still held the same determination that had driven his search. The small regional airport appeared below, a modest facility serving the rural communities she had chosen to help. As the jet touched down, James felt the weight of every mile, Every year, every moment that had led to this, his driver was waiting with a discreet black car, ready to navigate the back roads to her clinic. The drive through Louisiana's rural landscape was a journey through her past. Every sight seemed to echo stories she had shared that night, the jazz clubs she had mentioned, the neighborhoods where her grandmother had practiced traditional healing, the communities she had dreamed of serving. The car wound through small towns and past old plantation homes, each mile bringing him closer to the woman who had saved his life and transformed his world. Spanish moss swayed in the gentle breeze, creating patterns of light and shadow on the road ahead. The air grew thicker, heavier with humidity and the scent of magnolias. This was her world, the place she had spoken of with such love during those precious hours they had shared. The driver turned onto a smaller road, following directions to the newly renovated clinic. Through gaps in the trees, James caught glimpses of the building, a beautiful old structure given new purpose, its wide porches and graceful columns blending perfectly with the local architecture. The grounds were immaculate, with gardens full of both ornamental and medicinal plants, just as she had envisioned. His heart began to race as they approached. Through the front window of the clinic, he could see movement, staff preparing for the day, patients beginning to arrive. And then, through the glass, he saw her. 25 years fell away in an instant. She stood at a nurse's station, reading a patient's chart. Her hair now held elegant strands of silver among the dark curls, and reading glasses perched on her nose, but her presence was unchanged. The same grace in her movements, the same focused care as she studied the medical records. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to his chest, feeling his heart respond to her presence just as it had that night. The car came to a stop, but James sat motionless, watching her through the window. She looked up briefly, the morning sun catching her profile, and he saw the same warmth in her expression that had comforted him during his darkest hours. She was still humming, he noticed, the slight movement of her head keeping time to what he was sure was an old jazz tune. 25 years of searching, of hoping, of following every possible lead had led to this moment. The woman who had saved his life, who had shown him what it meant to have true purpose, was just yards away. Every beat of his heart seemed to echo the time that had passed. Every breath measured the distance yet to cross. Through the window, he watched her interact with her staff, saw how they responded to her quiet authority and genuine warmth. She had built everything she had dreamed of that night, a place where healthcare was human, where modern medicine worked in harmony with traditional wisdom, where healing meant treating the whole person. The community health fair was beginning to set up in the grounds around the clinic. Tables were being arranged under ancient oak trees, banners announcing free cardiac screenings and health education programs. This was her vision made real, healthcare brought directly to the people who needed it most. James watched as she moved through the clinic, stopping to check on patients, offering words of encouragement to staff members, embodying everything she had passionate about during their long-ago conversation. She had done it. Achieved every dream she had shared with him that night, built something remarkable out of dedication and compassion. The moment stretched like honey in sunlight, sweet with anticipation and heavy with possibility. Should he walk in now? Wait for a quieter moment? 25 years of searching, and still he wasn't quite sure how to cross these final few steps. Then she looked up, her eyes moving casually toward the window, and time stopped. The clipboard she had been holding clattered to the floor, the sound inaudible through the glass, but visible in the sudden stillness of her body. Recognition dawned in her eyes, and James watched as her hand flew to her mouth, tears welling up instantly. Their gazes locked across time and space, across 25 years of separate journeys that had somehow led them back to each other. In that moment, every year of searching, every dead end, every disappointment dissolved in the warmth of her eyes. They were no longer the young resident and the recovering patient, but two people who had carried each other in their hearts through a quarter-century of living. The world seemed to hold its breath as they stared at each other through the window, neither moving, both frozen in a moment of recognition that bridged 25 years of separation. Everything had changed, their hair now silver, their faces lined with experience. Yet in that moment of connection, nothing had changed at all. Chapter 8. Recognition time seemed to crystallize in that moment of recognition, the world narrowing to the space between them. Through the clinic window, their eyes remained locked, neither able to look away, neither quite believing that 25 years of separation had finally ended. The clipboard lay forgotten at her feet, papers scattered like memories across the polished floor. James's hand trembled on the car door handle, his heart racing with a different kind of urgency than it had that night so long ago. She hadn't moved, one hand still pressed to her mouth, tears gathering in eyes that still held the warmth of summer evenings. The years fell away as they gazed at each other, every moment of searching condensing into this single point of recognition. Around them, the clinic continued its morning routine. Staff members moved about their duties, patients arrived for appointments, the health fair setup progressed on the grounds. But for James and the doctor who had saved his life, time had stopped, suspended in the space between heartbeats. He opened the car door slowly, his movements deliberate, as if any sudden motion might shatter this precious moment. As he stepped out into the humid Louisiana morning, her eyes followed him, widening with a mix of disbelief and dawning joy. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and the distant sound of jazz from someone's open window, a perfect backdrop for their reunion. Through the window, he saw her take a steadying breath, her professional composure warring with obvious emotion. A young nurse touched her arm, asking if she was all right, but she seemed unable to form words. Her eyes never left James as he walked toward the clinic entrance, each step measured, each moment weighted with 25 years of waiting. The clinic's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, admitting him into her world. The interior was exactly as he had imagined from her description that night, warm and welcoming, blending modern medical efficiency with comfortable, homey touches. Local art adorned the walls, and comfortable rocking chairs lined the waiting area, just as she had envisioned. She had moved into the hallway now, still staring at him as if he might disappear like a morning mist. Her hair, now streaked with elegant silver, was pulled back in the same neat style she had worn that night. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, swaying slightly with her trembling breath. They stood mere feet apart, the distance between them nothing compared to the years they had spent searching. Up close, he could see how time had touched her. Fine lines around her eyes that crinkled with emotion, a mature grace that had replaced youthful energy, a depth of experience in her gaze that spoke of lives touched and hearts healed. "It's really you," she whispered, her voice carrying the same warm tones he remembered, now roughened with emotion. Her hand reached out, hesitating just short of touching him, as if confirming his solidity. After all these years... James felt his own eyes filling with tears as he nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many different ways had he planned to tell her what her brief presence in his life had meant? Now, face to face after 25 years, words seemed inadequate. They moved at the same moment, closing the distance between them. Her arms went around him as naturally as if no time had passed, and he held her close, feeling her tears dampen his shoulder. The steady beating of her heart against his chest echoed the rhythm she had once monitored so carefully, now strong and sure, after 25 years of purpose. "I never stopped looking for you," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "Every clinic I opened, Every medical conference I attended, every healthcare initiative I funded, it was all in hopes of finding you again." She pulled back slightly, her hands moving to frame his face, studying the changes time had wrought. "I saw the clinics in the news," she said softly, wonder in her voice. "All those community health centers, the educational programs, the research funding. That was you." He covered her hands with his own, feeling the strength in them that had once saved his life. "It was all because of you," he replied. "Everything you talked about that night, making healthcare more accessible, more human, integrating modern medicine with community wisdom, it became my mission too." Around them, the clinic had gone quiet. Staff and patients watched in amazed silence as their usually composed doctor embraced this silver-haired stranger, both of them crying unashamedly. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a gentle glow that seemed to enfold them in their own private world. She laughed softly, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I used to imagine running into you at medical conferences," she admitted. "I looked for your name at every hospital I worked in, hoping our paths would cross again, but after a while—" "The years just kept passing," he finished for her, understanding in his voice. "But I never gave up. How could I? You didn't just save my life that night, you showed me what living really meant." Their eyes met again, and in that moment of connection, 25 years seemed to compress into a single heartbeat. They were no longer the young resident and the recovering patient, but two people who had carried each other's influence through a quarter-century of living, loving, and healing. She touched the spot where his scar lay beneath his shirt, her doctor's hands remembering. "Your heart?" she asked, professional concern mixing with personal care. "Have you been taking care of it?" "It's never been stronger," he assured her, covering her hand with his own. "Though it's been searching for you all these years." More tears spilled down her cheeks as she smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. "I have so much to tell you," she said, gesturing to the clinic around them, "about the work we're doing here, the lives we're touching." "I want to hear everything," he replied, his voice fervent with sincerity. "Every dream you've achieved, every goal you've reached, every life you've changed. I've been following your work through medical journals, but I want to hear it all from you." A young nurse approached tentatively, reminding them of the day's schedule. "Doctor, the health fair is about to begin." She laughed, wiping away more tears. "Of course the health fair. Would you—" She turned to James, suddenly shy. "Would you like to stay? See what we've built here?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, his heart full to bursting as he watched her transform back into the capable doctor he remembered, though now she kept glancing at him as if to ensure he hadn't vanished. Throughout the morning they moved through the health fair together, their shoulders occasionally brushing, neither wanting to be too far from the other. She introduced him to her staff, to community members, to patients who spoke glowingly of her care. He watched her work, saw how she had maintained that perfect balance of professional skill and personal warmth that had so impressed him that night. Between patients, they stole moments to share pieces of their lives, each revelation building a bridge across the years they had spent apart. She still hummed jazz while she worked, he noticed with joy, and her eyes still lit up when she talked about making healthcare more accessible to those in need. The morning passed in a blur of introductions, explanations, and shared glances that held 25 years of unspoken words. They had so much to tell each other, so many years to account for, so many dreams to share. But for now, simply being in each other's presence was enough. The search was over, the connection re-established, the hearts reunited. Chapter 9. Truth and Time. After the morning's health fair wound down, she led James to her office, a warm, welcoming space that perfectly reflected the woman he'd come to know 25 years ago. Medical degrees and certifications lined one wall, while the other displayed children's drawings from grateful patients. A large window overlooked the clinic's herb garden, where traditional healing plants grew alongside ornamental flowers. "Coffee?" she offered, moving to a small coffee maker on a side table. "Still black with one sugar?" The fact that she remembered such a small detail from that night made his heart skip a beat. She still moved with the same graceful efficiency he remembered, though now tempered by years of experience. "You remember," he said softly, watching as she prepared their drinks. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching the silver in her hair, making it gleam like starlight. She handed him his cup, their fingers brushing briefly, sending a current of recognition through both of them. "I remember everything about that night," she replied, settling into her chair. Her office held the subtle scent of herbs and coffee, creating an atmosphere of intimacy. "It was the night everything changed, though I didn't know it then." She took a deep breath, her hands cupping her coffee mug, as if drawing strength from its warmth. "I owe you an explanation," she began, her voice carrying the weight of 25 years. "That morning, when I left—" Her eyes grew distant with memory. "My grandmother had a stroke," she continued, the pain of that day still evident in her voice. "The call came just as my shift was ending. She was the one who had raised me, who had inspired me to become a doctor. I had to go immediately. She was asking for me, and the doctors weren't sure how long." She paused, collecting herself. James reached across the desk, covering her hand with his. "Your grandmother, the one who taught you about traditional healing, who lived near Frenchman Street." Her eyes filled with tears at his recollection. "Yes, you remember that too?" "I remember every story you told me that night," he replied gently. "I've carried them with me all these years." She turned her hand to squeeze his briefly before continuing. "The next few months were a blur. Grandmother recovered partially, but she needed constant care. I had to make a choice, continue my residency in the city or return home to care for the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me." The choice was clear in her voice, a decision made from love, despite the professional consequences. "I transferred to a smaller hospital near home, adjusted my specialization to community health because that's what was needed. The years that followed—" She gestured to the certificates on her wall, the awards for community service, the thank you notes from patients. "You built something remarkable," James said, his eyes taking in the evidence of a life dedicated to healing. "Everything you talked about that night, making healthcare more accessible, combining traditional wisdom with modern medicine, you made it all real." She smiled, touching a child's crayon drawing of herself in her white coat. "It wasn't the path I'd planned, but it became the path I was meant for. Working in these communities, seeing the difference we could make." Her eyes met his. "But I thought about you, especially when I'd read about new cardiac treatment methods, or when I'd see reports about healthcare initiatives in urban areas." Rising, she moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings about his healthcare foundation, articles about the clinics he'd established. "When I saw these, I wondered, but your name is so common, and the photos in business journals were always so formal, I couldn't be sure." James stood too, moving to look at the articles with her. "I looked for you everywhere," he admitted. "Every medical conference, every hospital directory, every community health program, but without knowing more details." They stood close together, both looking at the paper trail of their separate journeys. "It's strange," she mused, "how our paths ran parallel all these years. Both of us working to improve healthcare, both of us trying to make a difference. Both of us remembering," James added softly. She nodded, turning to face him. This close, he could see the subtle signs of aging that made her even more beautiful. Laugh lines around her eyes, the elegant silver threading through her dark hair, the confidence that came from years of saving lives and healing hearts. After grandmother passed, she continued, leading them to a more comfortable seating area by the window, I could have returned to the city, to the career I'd originally planned, but by then I'd seen the desperate need for good healthcare in rural communities. How could I leave when there was so much work to be done? James settled into a chair opposite her, noting how the afternoon light painted patterns across the floor. You found your purpose, he said, just like you helped me find mine. She looked at him questioningly, and he explained about the transformation of his business focus, how her influence had led him to establish healthcare initiatives across the country. Every clinic I opened, every program I funded, they were all based on the vision you shared that night, and each one was a hope that somehow, somewhere, our paths would cross again. Tears gleamed in her eyes as she listened. All those lives touched, all those communities helped, and it started with one night in a hospital room. One night that changed everything, he agreed softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both absorbing the weight of their shared history and separate journeys. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office, and outside they could hear the subtle sounds of the clinic winding down for the day. I want to show you something, she said suddenly, standing and moving to her desk. From a drawer, she pulled out an old medical journal, my first published paper on community cardiac care, the methodology. She hesitated, then continued. I developed it thinking about our conversation that night, about how you said success felt empty without purpose. James took the journal, noting the publication date, just 3 years after that night. The paper detailed an innovative approach to cardiac care that combined community outreach with modern treatment methods. This is remarkable, he said, reading through the methodology she'd developed. You were pioneering community-based preventive care when most doctors were still focused solely on treatment. She smiled, touching the worn cover of the journal. I had no idea if you'd ever see it, but I wanted to show that your survival meant something, that the lessons from that night went on to help others. The truth of their separation lay between them, not a dramatic story of star-crossed lovers, but the reality of life's demands and responsibilities. Choices made from love and duty, paths taken out of necessity and purpose. 25 years of living, healing, and making a difference in their own ways. Did you ever? James began, then paused, unsure how to ask about her personal life over the years. She understood the unspoken question. There were relationships, she admitted quietly, but none that lasted. How could they? Every man I met was measured against one night of perfect understanding, against a connection that seemed almost magical in memory. Her honesty encouraged him to share his own experiences. I tried dating, but it never felt right. They all said the same thing, that I was in love with a memory, an ideal no real person could match. And were they right? She asked softly, her eyes meeting his. No, he replied simply. They just didn't understand that some connections transcend time and distance. That one genuine moment of understanding can be worth more than years of compromise. Chapter 10. Understanding. As the sun began its slow descent over the Louisiana landscape, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, James and the doctor who had saved his life continued their conversation. Her office had become a sanctuary where 25 years of separate lives were finally being woven together, each shared story, another thread connecting past to present. Tell me about your clinics, she said, moving to the window that overlooked her healing garden. The late afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, creating a halo effect that made James's breath catch. I've read about them in medical journals, but I want to hear about them from you. James joined her at the window, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but maintaining a respectful distance. The first one was in Brooklyn, he began, watching as birds flitted among her herb garden. "I remembered how you talked about making healthcare accessible to communities that needed it most. It took 3 years of planning, but we created a model that combined state-of-the-art cardiac care with community outreach programs." She turned to him, her eyes bright with interest. "The integrated care approach. That was you?" Professional excitement mixed with personal warmth in her voice. "We've been using modified versions of those protocols here. They've revolutionized how we handle preventive care in rural communities." Her words made his heart swell with pride and something deeper. "Everything I built was inspired by our conversation that night. You talked about healthcare being more than just treating symptoms, about how true healing meant understanding the whole person, their community, their traditions." "And you remembered all that? After all these years?" Her voice held wonder and a touch of vulnerability. "I remembered everything," he replied softly. "Every word, every idea, every dream you shared. They became my blueprint for making a difference." They settled into comfortable chairs near the window, the garden providing a peaceful backdrop to their continued conversation. As crickets began their evening chorus, they shared stories of lives lived in parallel, his work establishing healthcare initiatives across the country, her journey building this remarkable community health center. "What made you choose this location?" he asked, genuinely curious about the decision that had led her to this particular corner of Louisiana. She smiled, gesturing to the community visible beyond. Her garden. This area had one of the highest rates of untreated cardiac conditions in the state. People here had traditional healing knowledge passed down through generations, but limited access to modern medical care. It seemed like the perfect place to bridge that gap, to create something that honored both worlds. James watched as she described her work, noting how her whole face lit up with passion. Time had added character to her beauty, each line earned through years of dedicated service. Her enthusiasm was unchanged from that night 25 years ago, but now it was tempered with the wisdom of experience. "The community was skeptical at first," she continued, her voice taking on the rich cadence of storytelling. "They'd seen too many outsiders come in, thinking they knew better than local healers. But I remembered what my grandmother taught me, about listening more than speaking, about respecting traditional wisdom while offering new possibilities." She rose and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a thick album. "Look at this," she said, settling beside him on the small sofa. The album contained photos documenting the clinic's evolution, from groundbreaking to present day. Each image told a story of community involvement, of bridges built between old ways and new medicine. Their shoulders touched as they leaned over the album together, and James was acutely aware of her presence. The scent of her perfume, subtle and sophisticated, mingled with the herbs from her garden drifting through the open window. 25 years melted away as they studied the photos, their comments and observations flowing naturally, finishing each other's thoughts as if no time had passed. "This was our first community health fair," she explained, pointing to a photo of elderly women teaching young medical students about local medicinal plants. "We made it a true exchange of knowledge. Our staff learned as much as they taught." James recognized the approach immediately. "Creating partnerships instead of hierarchies," he said, remembering their discussion about healthcare accessibility, "just like you talked about that night." She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the changes time had wrought. His silver hair suited him, she thought, and the lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and determination. "You really did listen," she said softly, "not just to the words, but to the heart behind them." "How could I not?" he replied, matching her tone. You didn't just save my life that night. You showed me what living meant. Everything I've done since then has been an attempt to prove worthy of that gift." The setting sun cast long shadows across her office, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged confidences. They talked about their successes and failures, their hopes and disappointments, the lives they'd touched and the challenges they'd faced. "Did you ever regret it?" he asked carefully. "Leaving the big city hospital for this?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "There were hard days," she admitted. "Days when I wondered if I'd made the right choice, if I could have helped more people in a major medical center. But then I'd see the difference we were making here, watching generations of families learn to take care of their health, seeing traditional healers work alongside medical students, knowing we were creating something unique and valuable." Her voice trailed off as she looked around her office, at the walls covered with thank you notes and children's drawings. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. This was where I was meant to be." James understood completely. "Sometimes our hearts know better than our heads," he said. "They lead us where we need to go, even if the path isn't what we expected." She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Is that why you searched for so long? Your heart telling you not to give up?" "Yes," he answered simply. "Every success felt incomplete without sharing it with the person who inspired it. Every clinic I opened, every life we helped. I kept hoping you'd somehow see what your influence had created and find your way back." The cicadas had begun their evening symphony, their song drifting through the open window along with the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine. Time seemed to slow in the gathering dusk, creating a pocket of intimacy in her gradually darkening office. "I dream about that night sometimes," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the conversations we had, the hopes we shared, the kiss." She paused, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "For years I wondered if I'd romanticized it in memory, made it more significant than it was." James's hand found hers in the growing darkness. "It was real," he assured her. "Everything about that night was real. That's why I never stopped searching." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, hands joined, listening to the night sounds of Louisiana, drifting through the window. The distance between them, both physical and temporal, seemed to dissolve in the gentle evening air. "I should show you the rest of the clinic," she said finally, though she made no move to rise. "There's so much more to share. So many dreams made real." "We have time," James replied softly, squeezing her hand. "After 25 years, we finally have time." The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. 25 years of separate journeys had led them back to each other, older and wiser perhaps, but with hearts still capable of recognizing their other half. Through the window, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed their separation 25 years ago now watched as they found their way back to each other, their lives having carved separate but parallel paths toward the same destination. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of stories yet to share, understandings to reach, and possibilities to explore. They had both lived full lives in their time apart, touched countless other lives through their work, created legacies that would continue to make a difference. But now, in the growing darkness of her office, surrounded by evidence of dreams fulfilled and lives changed, they were simply two people rediscovering a connection that had never truly been lost. Chapter 11. Coming Home. The Louisiana evening wrapped around them like a warm embrace as they stepped out of her office into the clinic's garden. Cicadas serenaded them from the shadows, and the air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Stars were beginning to pepper the darkening sky, each one a witness to this moment 25 years in the making. "I'd love to show you something," she said, leading him along a winding path through the herb garden. The herbs released their fragrance as they brushed past, rosemary, sage, and local medicinal plants she had incorporated into her healing practice. Each step seemed to carry them further into the heart of the world she had created. They reached a small courtyard tucked away behind the clinic, where an old jazz club once stood. "This is where it all started," she explained, her voice soft with memory. "When I first found this property, this courtyard was overgrown, forgotten, but I could still feel the echoes of music in these walls." James looked around, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Like the clubs near your grandmother's house?" he asked, remembering her stories from that night so long ago. She smiled, pleased that he remembered. "Exactly. Now on Friday evenings, local musicians come to play for our patients. We found that music therapy, combined with traditional medicine and modern healthcare, creates something truly healing." In the growing darkness, the courtyard seemed magical. String lights twinkled overhead, creating a soft glow that reminded James of the monitor lights from that fateful night. She moved to an old piano that sat protected from the elements under a small alcove. "Do you still hum while you work?" he asked, watching as her fingers traced the keys without pressing them. "Every day," she replied, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "The nurses tease me about it, but the patients seem to find it soothing." She pressed a key softly, letting a single note float into the evening air. "The same tune I was humming that night." Without warning, she began to play, her fingers finding the keys in the dim light. The melody was gentle, familiar. The same jazz standard she had hummed while checking his vitals 25 years ago. The music floated through the courtyard, wrapping around them like a memory made tangible. James moved closer, drawn by the music and the woman playing it. In the soft glow of the string lights, time seemed to blur. She was both the young resident who had saved his life and the accomplished doctor who had built this remarkable place, each version equally precious to him. The song ended on a soft note that seemed to linger in the humid air. She remained seated at the piano, her hands resting quietly on the keys. "I played this song every night for a year after I left," she confessed. "It became my way of keeping that night alive, of holding on to the connection we'd shared." James's hand found her shoulder, a gentle touch that carried 25 years of searching. "I understand," he said softly. "Everything I built, every clinic I opened, every life we helped, they were all ways of keeping your dream alive, of maintaining that connection." She turned on the piano bench to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Was it real?" she whispered. "What I felt that night, what I've carried in my heart all these years." Instead of answering immediately, James knelt beside the piano bench, taking her hands in his. The position reminded them both of that night, when she had checked his pulse and found more than just impatient. "Let me tell you what I know is real," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that 25 years ago, a remarkable young doctor saved my life and showed me what living truly meant. I know that every dream she shared that night has been made real, touching countless lives and healing countless hearts. I know that I've measured every moment of success, every achievement, against the standard of purpose she taught me." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, but she didn't move to wipe them away. Her hands tightened on his as he continued. "I know that searching for her gave my life direction, that trying to be worthy of her influence made me a better man. And I know, sitting here now, that what I felt that night wasn't just gratitude or attraction or even admiration. It was recognition. Recognition of a soul that understood mine completely." The cicadas had grown quiet, as if listening. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of jazz drifting from somewhere in the neighborhood, a musical reminder of the city's endless soul. The moments stretched between them, weighted with 2 lifetimes of purpose and dedication. "After my grandmother's stroke," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to choose between duty and desire. I chose duty, and it led me here, to this place where I could fulfill the dreams I shared with you that night. But I never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping." James reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away tears. "Every choice you made, every path you took, brought you exactly where you were meant to be. Look at what you've created here. It's more beautiful than anything we imagined that night." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, they held a certainty that made his heart race. "Dance with me," she asked softly, standing and pulling him up with her. In the courtyard where jazz once ruled, under stars that had witnessed their separation and reunion, they began to move together. No music played except the gentle symphony of evening sounds, but they didn't need it. Their hearts kept time with a rhythm 25 years in the making. "I've loved you for a quarter century," James murmured, as they swayed together. "Through every success, every setback, every moment of searching, my heart has belonged to you." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes reflecting the twinkling lights above. "I think I've loved you since that night," she confessed. "Not just the memory of you, but everything you represented, purpose, dedication, the courage to chase dreams no matter how impossible they seemed." The evening air grew softer around them, carrying the mixed perfume of night-blooming flowers and medicinal herbs. They had both lived full lives in their time apart, touched countless others through their work, created legacies that would continue making differences long after they were gone. But in this moment, in this courtyard filled with music's memory, they were simply two hearts finally finding their way home. "Stay," she whispered, the word carrying all the weight of 25 years of separation. "Not just tonight, not just tomorrow, but forever," James finished for her, drawing her closer. "I've spent 25 years looking for you. Now that I've found you again, I'm never letting go." Their first kiss in 25 years tasted of tears and joy and possibilities. Around them, the Louisiana night continued its gentle symphony. Stars twinkled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a jazz saxophone wailed a song of homecoming. They had come full circle, back to each other, back to the connection that had sparked that night so long ago in a hospital room. But this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. 25 years of living, growing and searching had prepared them for this moment, for the journey they would now take together. Their separate paths had led them here, to this courtyard where music once played, where healing now happened, where love had finally found its way home. Chapter 12. Full Circle. They chose to marry in the hospital chapel where they first met, but with a profound difference that moved many guests to tears. The ceremony was performed by a young black female cardiologist who had received her medical education through their joint scholarship program. She stood before them, a living testament to their shared legacy, her presence bridging their past and future. The chapel's transformation reflected both their journeys. Alongside the magnolias and jasmine from Louisiana, there were herbs from her healing garden and framed photographs showing the evolution of their healthcare initiatives. Each pew held a small tribute. On one side, photos of his urban clinics that had revolutionized community healthcare. On the other, stories from her rural patients whose lives she had transformed. The guests represented a living tapestry of their life's work. In the front row sat elderly patients from her first rural clinic, beside executives who had helped James establish his healthcare foundation. Behind them were young medical students, their faces shining with admiration, each one a recipient of scholarships they had created. Every person present was connected to their mission of healing and hope. She walked down the aisle to a special arrangement of the jazz tune she had hummed that night, now performed by a quartet of musicians who had recovered in her cardiac rehabilitation program. Her cream-colored dress, elegant in its simplicity, was adorned with handmade lace created by the women of her Louisiana community. Around her neck, her grandmother's locket held two photos, one of the woman who had raised her and one of the hospital room where her journey with James began. James waited at the altar, his silver hair distinguished, his posture straight despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. In his pocket, he carried the original hospital chart from that night, its pages now yellowed with age, but the words still clear. Patient stabilized by doctor. The name that had eluded him for 25 years now belonged to the woman walking toward him. Their vows were deeply personal, yet universal in their message of purpose and healing. They spoke not just of their love for each other, but of their shared commitment to continuing their mission. They promised to combine their approaches to healthcare, creating a comprehensive program that would touch even more lives. 25 years ago, James began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, in this very building, you saved more than just my life. You saved my soul by showing me that success without purpose is empty. Every clinic I've opened, every life we've touched, every dream we've made real, they all began with you. Today I pledge not just my love, but my continued commitment to the vision you shared with me that night. Her response moved many to tears. In those precious hours between life and death, you became more than just a patient. You became the catalyst for everything I would build. Even when duty called me away, the memory of our connection guided every decision, every innovation, every life saved. Today, I pledge not just my love, but my dedication to continuing our shared mission of healing both bodies and spirits. The exchange of rings carried profound symbolism. Each band was crafted by an artisan from her Louisiana community, incorporating a delicate heartbeat pattern. The gold had been melted down from medical pins she had received throughout her career, while his contained metal from the first medical equipment he had donated to a community clinic. Their first kiss, as husband and wife, was blessed by soft jazz notes and afternoon sunlight streaming through the chapel windows, creating a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. In that sacred space, they were both their younger and present selves, their love having matured like fine wine over 25 years of purpose and dedication. The reception transformed the hospital's community center into a celebration of their joint legacy. Instead of traditional decorations, the walls displayed a timeline, photographs and news clippings showing the evolution of their separate but parallel journeys in healthcare. Each table featured centerpieces incorporating medical texts and healing herbs, representing the bridge they had built between traditional and modern medicine. Their first dance was accompanied by a special performance. The jazz quartet was joined by a choir of nurses from both their facilities, singing a song that had been composed by a patient whose life they had touched. The lyrics spoke of healing, hope, and the power of purpose-driven love. As evening approached, they stood together on the hospital's rooftop garden, another project they had jointly created to give patients a healing space. The setting sun painted the sky in the same colors they had witnessed 25 years ago, but now they watched it together, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in perfect synchronization. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a young medical student talking animatedly with one of her traditional healers from Louisiana. "That's what we've built. Bridges between worlds, between approaches to healing, between hearts." James drew her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "And now we get to build even more together. Every clinic, every program, every life we touch, they're all part of the dream you shared with me that night." Their departure from the reception was marked by a unique tradition they had created. Instead of throwing rice or flower petals, their guests each released a paper lantern into the evening sky, each one carrying a message of hope from a patient whose life had been touched by their work. The sight of hundreds of Lanterns rising into the darkening sky, carrying messages of healing and gratitude, moved everyone to tears. They left not for a honeymoon destination, but for a journey of purpose, a tour of their combined healthcare networks, now to be united under a shared vision. Their wedding gifts, at their request, had all been converted to scholarships for underprivileged medical students, ensuring their legacy would continue through future generations of healers. As they drove away from the hospital chapel, the same stars that had witnessed their separation now blessed their union. 25 years had given them wisdom, purpose, and a love that had grown stronger through separation. Their story had come full circle, back to where it began, but this was no ending. It was a beginning enriched by years of dedicated service, strengthened by separate journeys of healing, and made perfect by a love that had never wavered. The night embraced them as they headed toward their future, their hearts beating in rhythm with the jazz music that had accompanied their journey. They had built separate legacies of healing and hope. Now they would build an even greater one together, their love story inspiring generations of healers to believe in the power of purpose and the patience of true love. Here are 5 powerful lessons from this love story. 1. True love transcends time and distance. It's about finding someone who shares your deepest purpose and values. 2. Every obstacle in life can lead to something meaningful. Her grandmother's illness led her to help rural communities, while his search for her helped thousands through healthcare initiatives. 3. When we act with purpose and compassion, our personal journeys can create positive change in others' lives, even through times of separation and longing. 4. Age brings wisdom and depth to love. Their reunion at 65 was richer because of the lives they had lived and the good they had done. 5. Life sometimes takes us on unexpected paths, but if we stay true to our purpose and keep faith in our heart's direction, we may find our way back to what matters most. Subscribe if you liked.